to it. I focused on the home front. What was it like living in Kinston, living in Lenoir County during the years of the Civil War? How did the war impact your lives? And that's what my research has been, more of a social history. I don't know what that was. Let's see. I thought it was an arrow.
Go to the right side, the right arrow.
All right, did I go the wrong way? There we go. Here we go. Sorry about that. All right, the other left. All right, a little bit about. Let me real quick tell you about Lenoir County. Lenoir County is interesting. It's one of several counties in eastern North Carolina that actually, according to the 1860 census, there were more African Americans, slaves primarily, living in this county than there were white people. And it's interesting. Well, more on that in a minute. I put the numbers up here. I thought it was interesting. The county population census of 1860, 10,226, 4,902 white citizens, 5,142 enslaved, and 178 free blacks. And more on free blacks in a minute. What's interesting is that the majority of people in Lenoir County, like throughout the South, did not own slaves. My ancestors here lived in the Pink Hill area, yeoman farmers, 100 acres or less of land, family farm, never owned a slave. Now that doesn't mean they were against slavery. Why did they not have a slave? Everybody knows, right? They were too expensive. They couldn't afford a slave. But there were some fairly big slave owners in the Kinston area, north of here, west towards what they used to call Mosley Hall, the Grange. And the average slave owner was 10 or less. But there were two of the biggest slave owners in North Carolina here in Lenoir County. John Tull, who was 148 slaves. I think he was like the top 10 slave owners in the state. And a guy named Counsel Wooten had 133. So there were two really large slave owners in Lenoir County. But the majority of people did not own slaves here. But again, the population was majority African American. Kinston itself was about 1,300 people, 1,333. And it's interesting here, it's much closer here. It's just a few more African Americans in Kinston, 662 white people, 635 slaves, and then 36 free blacks. So that was much closer. Kinston is just a little bit, a few more African Americans than whites, but not many. And do what now?
Were there any free blacks that owned slaves?
Not in Lenoir County, not that I'm aware of, not here. Now, yes, it did happen, but I'm not aware of it happening here. Didn't see any of the records or anything. Lenoir County, or I should say Kinston was, again, not real big, but it was the commercial kind of center of this area, not only Lenoir, but Greene County, Pitt County, some of the rural areas around here. There were quite a few artisans, craftsmen, stores. There was some recreational, like a hotel here, a couple of factories. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Again, it was what I call the commercial kind of hub for this area. Here's this picture we'll look at in a little bit more detail in a minute, showing what was called Main Street a little bit later. Yeah, unfortunately, we have very few, if any, photographs of Lenoir County, especially Kinston, before the war. There are a few pictures, photographs available. Most of them are actually portraits of people and that kind of thing. Maybe a few structures, but really showing what Kinston looked like is very rare, if at all. And I have searched everywhere. National Archives, State Archives, Duke, Chapel Hill, different collections, East Carolina. This is a series of photographs taken in 1881 we'll look at in a few minutes, but apparently according to the photographer, Kinston hadn't changed a whole lot since the Civil War. And again, this is a great shot. This is actually Queen Street, which is of course the street right out front here. I put up here this picture about yeoman farmers like my family that was here. The great majority of people in Lenoir County were very small farmers. And the number one crop here was corn. They also grew beans. And I say beans being literally beans, like string beans, that kind of thing, right? Sweet potatoes, not a lot of cotton, mostly food crop. Now cotton was grown here, but again, most of the cotton, and it was grown by the wealthier slave owners that had the slaves to pick it, very labor intensive. And we know cotton was grown here, of course the census records it, plus I have accounts by Union soldiers about the cotton bales stacked up at the train station over here, not far from here, being ready to ship out. But the great majority of people here, again, because I looked at like my family, on the 1860 agricultural census, it's all corn, number one throughout the county, beans, soybeans, not soybeans, but sweet potatoes and things like that. I've already mentioned these two guys here again, John Tull and Council Wooten, big slave owners. But again, there were a fair number of people that owned slaves, particularly in the Kinston area, and they had not a lot, 10 or less slaves. Now here in Kinston, I've got, being kind of a commercial center, there were a lot of, well, craftsmen, carpenters, masons, coopers. Coopers made barrels, right? Sawyers. Anybody know what a sawyer is? Sawyer was basically someone that took like a log, piece of raw wood, and made it into lumber, which I had to look it up myself to find out what it meant, sawyer. Cabinet maker, tailor. They were very busy, of course, making clothes. Ready-made clothes were really not available here in Kinston. Most stuff was either, tailor-made and, of course, handed down, that kind of thing. Shoemaker, same thing. There was even a mattress maker here. And again, about 20 merchants, little general stores, that kind of thing, business owners. There were 4 physicians, medical doctors, a dentist, a lawyer, and druggist. And of course, a little more. But this kind of shows that Kinston, though small, it served the rural community around it with all these different craftsmen that could make and produce products that were needed on the local farms. Another big part of Kinston's history during the Civil War is the railroad, which, now how many of y'all went on the tour of the battlefield? Some of y'all went? Okay, yeah, well, the railroad, that, if you remember last night, a train came through right during our tour, which was kind of cool. Originally it was called the Atlantic in North Carolina, opened in 1858, and it ran from Goldsboro, west of here, down to the coast, down to Morehead Sear area.
Where was that picture taken?
This is Goldsboro.
Goldsboro.
This is Goldsboro. And this is one of the locomotives that actually ran through Kinston. Train service connected here to Goldsboro, to the Wilmington Weldon Railroad, and to the North Carolina Railroad. So from Kinston, by hitting a train, especially pre-war, really throughout the war, you could get to Raleigh, you could get western parts of the state, you could travel widely. I don't know what they're doing, they're putting stuff out. With the railroad, also there was a telegraph line, of course, for communication. Yeah, this is a great photo taken, and this is in the Goldsboro area. There were 2 carriage factories here. This is kind of interesting to me. The biggest was called Dibble and Brothers, and it was the equivalent of a modern day automobile factory. It had about 75 employees, and a lot of people in the census that said they worked at the local carriage factory, and they produced buggies and wagons, and of course we all know horse-drawn. And again, this was, I like to call it, the equivalent of the modern day kind of automobile factory. And again, it was a product, that's actually not it. I don't have a good picture of the Dibble brothers, but they made 600 buggies, and that's a lot, plus 100 wagons or so each year. And they, according to the 1860 census, big employer. What was kind of fun in my research, I found a lot of letters and diaries from Union soldiers, particularly, some good Confederate. This is actually a Union soldier here, and they told us what Kinston looked like during the Civil War. And this Union soldier in December '62, the first battle, said it seemed to be a place of more thrift and business and a more Yankee look than any place I have seen in the state. And before I go any farther, I did want to mention one thing. Kinston's place in history involving the 2 battles here, really in its overall Civil War history, everything sort of dates to 1862 March, because in that period, New Bern, of course, fell to Union occupation. So from March of '62 on the rest of the war, basically once you left Kinston and kind of headed on east, you began approaching Union occupation territory. So Kinston changed from just a place on the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad to almost like a front line, right? Again, you went a few miles east of here and you were technically in Yankee territory. And that will change everything about Kinston. We'll have more troops sent here, more fortifications built. There's more concern about the railroad operation. The 2 battles that took place are largely because of New Bern being occupied and then incursions coming in state. And Kinston was kind of, a real estate location. That's why Kinston got so actively involved in a lot of these battles and that sort of thing. This is, I love this. I don't know what's actually better. This is funny. A Confederate soldier in '62 who was stationed here wrote a letter home, and he said, "The young ladies up here is all right." I like we spell right. "And what makes it above charming, 'tis filled with the finest young ladies in the state." There were a lot of women in Kinston. Now what happened, part of that was, when New Bern fell, a lot of people, refugee status, right? They headed west and they came to Kinston, the first town they came to. A lot of women passed through here, families, children, and a lot of them stayed. There was a big hotel up here called the St. Charles, about a block or so from here, and it was a social point of Kinston. But apparently a lot of young women here, soldiers like that. There are a lot of descriptions of parties and socials and all kinds of picnics and activities involving the soldiers and the women of Kinston who may or may not have been from. Now I love this description here, y'all like this probably. In 65, after the Union came through the Battle of Wise Fork, occupation forces here, a guy named Charles Tournier, I think his diary, I think it's in East Carolina, he said he went out in the country and he found, he's got some great descriptions, but I love this. The women, mother and daughter, I added that, were quite plump, but very yellow. For the pastime, they chewed snuff sticks. All the Union soldiers here, whenever they describe local women, this is Union now. In 65, talk about the women all dipping snuff and chewing snuff, and they all had, bad teeth and yellow teeth, and this guy calls them yellow. And of course, the lady on the right here, she's not picking her nose. She's, I think, a little pinch of snuff there, right? But I remember my grandmother, who was born probably, she's long since passed, but 1890s maybe, and she dipped snuff. Does that ring a bell to you? I mean, you might have known grandparents and all that.
Two bros.
So, yeah, and I remember, this is awful, I remember spitting in like a Louisiana coffee can or something. Does it? Oh yeah. And she kept that thing. One time my sister and I actually looked in it. I don't know why. And it was just, I just had to know what was in that can, But anyway, they described the people using snuff, dipping snuff or chewing snuff. Now, this is interesting here. I knew someone was going to ask me. Y'all hadn't asked yet. Kinston's got a reputation, or did, for being full of prostitution, right? And I just did a World War II history of Kinston, by the way. I've got it out here, not trying to sell your book, but if you're interested in World War II, I've got a brand new book called Kinston, Lenoir County, during World War II. And I talk about all the prostitution here. Well, during the Civil War, with all these soldiers, all these women coming through, yes, it is true. Now, there's not a lot of documentation to it, but one soldier in 65, a Union guy wrote, the women in general dress very nice, but there are some bad houses. And of course, you can debate what that means, but I had a professor in East Carolina. I said, that might just mean it's a rundown old beat up house. And he went, no. So I had to change my thesis a little bit. I was trying to be nice to Kinston. My professor was like, no, that's no, okay. So anyway, Kinston did have a long history there about involving, you probably heard the area down here, what they call Sugar Hill, which is south of here, the edge of town. Here's some female occupations. Women really didn't, in the census of 1860 in Kinston, there's women here, but almost all of them are housewives. The only occupations I could find were like teacher, seamstress, right, sewing, a milliner, and my mind's going blank, milliner. It's like sewing, I think, or some type of sewing. It's hats, thank you, Ken, it's hats, that's it. I couldn't think. And domestic. Domestic means like a servant, a maid, a housekeeper. Thank you, Ken, I could not think. It was interesting, I love this. There was a lady who was single. She was 30, y'all. Old maid. You know that old term? Shouldn't say that quite. But her name was Jane Simpson, and she was listed in the census as a music and a French teacher. I love that. So I guess she gave private lessons and all that. But you don't find many single females. Widows, yes, but the age 30 and never married was kind of interesting. But she was a music and French teacher in Little Kinston in 1860. Other descriptions about the farms around, again, they never owned any slaves. They could not read or write. That was quite commonplace by Union soldiers. And I saw no books or papers. It's interesting, the Union soldiers in 1865 went out widely. They were looking for food. They were mighty fond of the local, y'all heard of something called Applejack? Oh, yeah. It's kind of like brandy, I guess, fortified. It was apparently pretty potent stuff. And they ride around and pretty much pillage and plunder and steal and go in your house and all that. And this same guy, Charles Tournier, mentioned that, I don't have the quote up here, that he went to a house, he saw no books or papers, the women appeared, the men were all gone at war, they were, quote, ignorant, and he talked about how destitute the house looked. He said it was so plain, he said the only decoration was a small china lamb, like a little figurine of a lamb or something like that, or sheep or whatever. And you know what's weird is I remember my grandmother had something like that in her house when I was a kid. I don't know what happened to it, but it was a little figurine on the shelf.
They hit all the good stuff, so the Yankees.
That's about right. That's about right. Now, free blacks, this is interesting. And we all know about free blacks. You could obtain freedom. Either you could be given freedom in a will, or your owner passed away. There were different ways to obtain freedom. You could buy freedom in certain situations. It became harder to get your freedom after 1860 in that period. But before the war, it could happen, and it did. Again, in Kinston, there were, what I said, well over 100 free blacks here. Free blacks tended to go to areas that were like towns and cities to, you know, they could find employment there and that kind of thing. I only found one occupation for a free black, which in this case, female, Sunisa Bird, age 32, mulatto, which of course means a mixed race, right? She was unmarried and a seamstress. And I've been working with the staff at the news. They're doing some more research on Sunisa, trying to find out more about her. But she was the only free black female that was listed with a job. The men that were free blacks were like laborers, farm labor. Some of them worked at the hotel, over here the Hotel St. Charles, carpenters, things like that.
Is that hotel still here?
It's gone,
Yeah.
long gone. It's over by the railroad track, about a block from the railroad there. I've already mentioned about everything here changed in 1862 when New Bern fell. If New Bern hadn't fallen, Kinston's entire Civil War history would be nowhere near as exciting, but that changed everything. And one thing that happened also after 1862 when New Bern fell, and this is interesting, I found a lot of documentation on this, is that the slaves in this area were like, I'm out of here. If I can get to New Bern, the word got back word of mouth. If I can get to New Bern, if I can run away and get to New Bern, I'll get my freedom. I'll be protected by the United States Army troops. And they did. By the hundreds, by the thousands from across eastern North Carolina. There was almost like an exodus of slaves. New Bern was like a mecca. Get there and freedom awaits. And there are all kinds of accounts right here in Lenoir County about slaves just running away in large numbers, particularly in, well, it would be summer, spring, into the fall of 1862, after March of 62. Here's a letter I found from a guy named James Lofton. He wrote his mother from here. A good many Negroes are running away and are going to the Yankees every day. All mine are gone, from the oldest to the youngest. They left as soon as they heard that New Bern had fallen. Matter of fact, it got so bad that people in Kinston, this area, moved their slaves west. They got them out of this area because it was just too tempting to get to New Bern. Yeah, that's a project I was working with there. I couldn't, this is kind of hard to see. I don't know why it turned out good. This is Sylvia. It's a picture of a lady here. That's the only picture I found of an enslaved woman from Lenoir County. I don't know much about her. The picture actually is in East Carolina University manuscript collection, but it is listed as, I forget what family she owned to. Did they have it up here? No, I went too far there. But anyway, that's hard to see that turned out well. But anyway, she was, that's actually one of the few photographs of a slave here from Lenoir County. We don't know a lot about the slaves here in Lenoir County, except this is a sort of kind of description. This is William Singleton. He actually kind of lived across the line past Wise Fork over in Craven County and moved around some with his owner. But he did come to Kinston, we know that much, and he did later write a book or an account, also at East Carolina University, and he talked about some of his slavery experiences. And the thing is, I'll put it up here. Did I put that? Here's years ago. Well, let me back up one thing. He did end up recruiting, I'm sorry. One thing I was going to mention, Singleton talked about the fact that he was only punished twice, whipped, as he calls it, twice. And it was bad. But he was whipped. It was interesting. The first time he got whipped, a white child in the family that were his master owners tattletaled on him, told on him, and told his daddy that he had opened a book, touching a book. Of course, you know, slaves were forbidden to read and write and be literate during this period of time. But apparently that was enough to acquire a severe whipping. The other time is kind of funny. Not the whipping is funny, but why it happened, weird. He went to church and he rode a mule. It wasn't a donkey, I think it was a mule. And he gets to church, and he gets there late, and he ties it up with other animals. Well, his mule, I don't know why, gets agitated and starts braying and whatever, and gets all the other horses upset, and all the animals are kind of, acting up, and it disrupts the church service. He got whipped for that, for his mule acting up. So he mentioned he only had 2 whippings, and those 2 he remembered. He also mentioned, I thought it was interesting though, it's not all negative. He said it wasn't all bad times. He said he particularly enjoyed the fact that they would occasionally have social outings. The different owners of slaves would bring them all together, the young people, and like mixers, I guess the idea to find a wife or a mate, right? Because if they got married and had children who were slaves, they were property. But he said it wasn't all terrible, but he did recount again. I remember the worst thing he said, you couldn't own anything, even your children. At any time, you or your children could be sold or bequeathed. That means like given to a child, sold out from under them and all that. But quite fascinating. And again, first person account. Later, I'll go ahead and put this up, I don't want to talk too long. He served in New Bern. He got to New Bern, of course. And he served in the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers. And later, 35th United States Colored Troops. And it said he recruited over 1,000 African Americans to serve in the United States Army. I think I'm going from memory, I may have a slide. I think over 5,000 runaway slaves enlisted in the United States Army in New Bern during the war years. Pretty amazing. And he wrote an autobiography in 1922. Kind of hard to find, but if you check that name and Google it, I think East Carolina's got a digitized online version, at least part of it. That's where I got a lot of my stuff from. And again, the Union troops, they formed up units out of Kinston that were African Americans. Another important, this guy's from Lenoir County, another runaway slave from here who got away to New Bern, like the other slaves I mentioned. Age 28, he enlisted also United States Army, and he was, of course, a sergeant, as you can see from what I there's like a corporal right here, but he was a sergeant, and he was with the 35th United States Colored Troops, named Bernie Bryant. He's also a Lenoir County young man, African American, escaped out of here. This is just a chart. I found this online. All these are people from Lenoir County. There's Bryant, Bernie Bryant's there, second to the top. And again, these were all people that ran away. It's interesting, as you probably well know, most of the last names are the name of the person that owned them, their masters and all that. But they escaped. You can see servant, driver, different kind of laborer, different types of things. They got the New Bern enlisted in the United States Army down there. Big recruitment going on in New Bern to get black troops to join up. During the home front here too, I found was interesting. The Army, again, the Union came through twice. I've got morale and the Eastern NC home front. Apparently a lot of people got really tired of the war. Oh, I got you. But a lot of people got really tired of the war. And apparently the Confederates would lock you up. If you spoke out too much or anything about the Confederacy, the war effort, or whatever was going on, you could be thrown in they put you in the local jail over here. All right, I'm going to finish up here real quick. I want to mention those photographs. This is really cool. 1884, William Reed comes back to Kinston, Lenoir County. Reed is a veteran of the 44th Massachusetts. He was in New Bern. He was involved in the First Battle of Kinston, in the 44th Mass that came through here, went on to Goldsboro, and of course went back to New Bern. And he decided in 1884 to come back 20 plus years later and visit, kind of like a reunion, and visit Eastern North Carolina, New Bern, and all the areas here. He came back in October with a friend, Charles McIntyre. There they are outside New Bern. And don't know all this, but skip this right here. He was a photographer, and he brought a camera with him. And he took some of the best photos, here we go, of Kinston, Lenoir. They're really the first photos of Kinston, Lenoir County. Again, this is directly from, it's almost like negatives here. Here's the Main Street, Kinston. These photos now are in Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, Southern Collection, and actually part of them, there's a couple of them that I'll show you one in a minute, I kind of stumbled on, is at the Craven County Library, which I thought was kind of cool. But this is now Queen Street, that's a picture. And he said in his writings that Kinston really hadn't changed that much as he remembered it back in 1862. There we go, this is one in New Bern I found. That's a very rare shot of the side of the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad Station during the war. Now this shot you see a lot. See the cotton bale? So, there's the railroad line. Straight in front of us would be towards Goldsboro. behind us here would be, Morehead City Manager. There's a side shot. Supposedly that cupola on top got hit by a Union artillery shell during the battle, according to some sources there. But that was the same train station that he saw in 1862. Here's the, now, this, he said, this is not the original bridge. He said this looked just like the original bridge. And my mind's going blank on the name of it. It might be Jones Bridge. But this is basically about the location where you crossed over the Neuse River here on 258 coming into Queen Street. It was a drawbridge configuration. See that ropes and stuff you could open up maybe for a steamer or something with a smokestack on it. It was actually burned partially in 62 and then burned again in 65 and it was repaired. But he said that it looked just like he remembered it. Interesting enough, when he was in Kinston in 1884, he said this bridge is fixing to go because the railroad is unloaded. They're unloading iron girders and metal work to build a first iron bridge over the Neuse River. And that was, so this was torn down right after he took this picture. The guy in the picture, I think, is probably Charles McIntyre. And I think it was probably taken by Reed, probably. Neuse River, looking down river, they had put jetties in it to help control the sand flow and keep the channel open. This is looking down towards Newbern. But he talked about, even in 1884, if you look at the woods here, trenches were built, and trenches from the particularly first battle of Kinston were still visible along the river. This is a road in Lenoir County I thought was kind of cool. Just one of the, you guys all know, of course, it was just no pavement really, except in town, maybe have some, actually Kinston was still all dirt, but just one of the rural roads here, paths. This is a house that was out from the first battle, kind of south of Kinston. It was used as a hospital by the Confederates, and I love the story. Reed said he talked to the owner, who was very nice, and the owner, what Reed said was funny because he said there were bullet holes all in the house, like musket balls had hit it, right? And he said they had never repaired it since the battle. And the owner said, I'm gonna get to it one day. It was like 20-some years later, they're gonna fix his house. It still had bullet holes in it. I like it. You look here, it was like a rooster chicken right there. It's kind of cool. Look at all different fences. And I talk in my book also about this guy, Simpson Harper. Dennis, who led y'all's tour, one of them with Wade, was related to him. And I like this story because there were 6 brothers from Lenoir County that went into the war. Every one of them survived. Statistically, that's pretty good, right? Now, one was wounded. I didn't know that today. I think one of the younger brothers was wounded twice, but didn't die. And nobody died from sickness. But these 6 Harper boys all went in and survived the war and all came home. And at least part of them, and they grew up right here at Wooding to the south here, if you know the area. But the interesting thing is, during the Battle of Wise Fort, they're only like less than 10 miles from home. It's one of those kind of weird things.
Wendell was my great-great-grandfather.
Which one?
Wendell.
Wendell, yeah. All right, so anyway, I throw this up here. And again, Lenoir County, great history. We're still doing research on it. I've got a lot more that I can talk about, but I know we need to get on out of here. And I just threw this up because this is for another program. But again, I do have a book also on Lenoir County during World War II. And I just want to mention the cool thing about this, there was a Marine Corps auxiliary airfield here that trained units tied into Cherry Point that trained throughout the war. And Marine aviators were here out at what now is the airport. And later became Stallings Airfield and all that. And of course, I talk about draft during World War II and a number of people from the county that served. There was a Medal of Honor winner here from LaGrange and all that. But that book just came out this last spring.
That's all we do.
And I am through. Y'all may ask questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah,